So welcome to our session, which is the goal of the session is to explore the intersections between the struggles of the LGBT or the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender communities, and how that fits within the broader Asian American Pacific Islander civil rights agenda. So this is a conference looking at advancing social justice and civil rights as they relate to Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. But a very important part of our community is the LGBT part of the community, and they share similar as well as somewhat different struggles. And so the goal is really to talk about the intersections with the ultimate goal of being, I know most of the people here, not everyone, but most people here work in organizations that are primarily focused on Asian Americans or Pacific Islander civil rights, and trying to figure out how do we, primarily as allies, actually incorporate the struggles of our LGBT members of our community as part of our larger social justice vision. So to echo Tom Perez's theme at lunch, how do we advance justice together and include in that advancing of justice the LGBT members of our community. So I'm going to minimize my speaking because we have such a great panel. What I'm going to do instead of introducing all of them is have them do a self-introduction. And I apologize, I guess I should have started out by introducing myself. My name is Karen Wong. I am Vice President of Programs at the Asian Pacific American Legal Center, which is one of the 4 co-hosts for this organization. We are actually the Los Angeles-based of the 4 affiliates. And we are a civil rights and legal services organization serving primarily Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, but as you heard at lunch, we also serve a lot of Latinos, as well as other communities. And actually we have, as an allied organization, been very involved in the struggle specifically for marriage equality in California. I'm going to ask my colleagues, starting with Ben de Guzman to my right, to briefly introduce themselves.
Thank you, Karen. We're supposed to talk into these, right? So my name is Ben de Guzman. I'm the co-director of programs for the National Queer Asian Pacific Islander Alliance. We're a relatively new federation of the 30-plus Asian American, Pacific Islander, Southeast Asian, and South Asian LGBT organizations around the country. A descriptive directory profiling them can be found in the back, the Queer Asian Compass. And so I just wanted to thank Karen for helping set this table, and for the Legal Center and all of the other affiliates for putting together this conference. I know it's been a long time coming, so I wanted to congratulate you on that as well. And just say that we're gonna speak a little more in depth about some of the issues that NCAPIA has been working on, but I just wanted to personally say that I'm really honored to be part of this distinguished panel. So thank you.
Noise, all this background noise. Hi, I'm Dorina Wong. I actually am wearing a couple of different hats. One hat is how that I'm affiliated with the Asian Pacific Islander queer women and transgender activists, and also the co-chair of API Equality LA. So Aqua, the activists, queer women activists, it was an organization that started around 2004 in reaction to the Bush re-election, and we were also depressed that we had to organize ourselves together and participate in some anti-war marches, and we realized that there wasn't really a queer women's group to organize politically on issues, and so we organized ourselves, and now we're trying to increase our visibility and provide a safe space for API queer women and transgender activists in LA County. And API Equality LA is an organization, a coalition of organizations and individuals that are working in Los Angeles on marriage equality and the fair treatment of LGBT families, and we do this through community education and advocacy. And we also actually kind of got prompted, we got a wake-up call in 2004 when there were some rallies in the Chinese community in reaction to the marriages in San Francisco of same-sex couples, and we were like kind of shocked because, as you know, in the APAC community, they never organize, right? They never go out and organize around any issue. And in response to the marriages, we realized that we had to do a lot of education within our community, so then we formed API Equality LA down here.
Hi, my name is Yong-Ho Kim. I work at the Korean Resource Center. I work on elections. The Korean Resource Center is a civil rights organization located in Koreatown, Los Angeles. And our mission is to organize and build a base of Korean Americans community service through the identification of grassroots leaders, educating and organizing them, and to engaging them through mass campaigns and to advocate for social change. Specifically, in the recent years, we have been working on immigrant rights, immigration reform, and health reform, and civic participation.
Hi, everybody. I'm Hector Vargas. I am the Deputy Director of the Education and Public Affairs Department for Lambda Legal. Lambda Legal is the oldest and largest national organization that serves, works for the civil rights of the LGBT community and people with HIV through impact litigation, public policy, and education efforts. We have 5 offices nationwide. We actually have an office here in Los Angeles, and our senior attorney and marriage project director, Jenny Pizer, is here from that office, so I just want to say hello and thanks. We work on the broad range of LGBT issues and HIV issues. So family recognition, relationship recognition, that's everything from marriage equality to finding other ways to ensure that same-sex relationships are recognized under the law, on parents and parenting issues, to recognize LGBT parents legally as parents and raising children, on workplace issues. We have an HIV project and a transgender rights project, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And we also work in particular on youth issues in schools and in out-of-home care.
Hi, my name is Ming Wong. I'm the helpline attorney at the National Center for Lesbian Rights. And we are, we don't just serve lesbians, we also serve, actually we recently took on some clients who are straight. The National Center for Lesbian Rights started off as the Lesbian Rights Project over 30 years ago in 1977. And back then, the focus of the organization was protecting mothers who had just come out as lesbian from losing their children to husbands who are often actually not even fit to be parents, but who were getting custody just because of the sexual orientation of the mother. Today, family law continues to make up a large part of our work. Almost 50% of our work is in family law, but we also have a number of projects, and I wanted to highlight 2 projects especially that I think are very relevant today. Our Family Protection Project, which is run by our staff attorney, Kathy Sakimura, and that's a project dedicated to ensuring that family law protections, that whatever family law protections that are available are made available in the broadest possible way to low-income families and families of color, because as we all know, just having formal equality isn't usually enough. You have to ensure that people have access to the laws that are supposed to protect them and their families. And then the other project that I wanted to highlight is our immigration project. And that's the one area, so we generally do impact litigation and public policy advocacy and public education, much like Lambda. But the one area where we do direct services is in immigration cases, mainly asylum cases, and we actually do take on a lot of, it's predominantly Latin American clients, but there are also a number of Middle Eastern and South Asian clients who are seeking asylum, and I would say about half the cases are transgender clients. So.
Okay, so thank you, and again, to the wonderful panelists. I'm actually really delighted to have all of them here at this particular conference. I wanted to explain, we're going to do a non-traditional panel, I think probably to the disappointment of some of my colleagues who are used to doing the PowerPoint presentations and the 10 minutes. And so because we have a lot of people here and we have a lot of interesting questions we want to get through, what I'm going to do is pose a series of questions, and the panelists are going to respond to them, not all of them, to every single one. And through that we are going to get through several of the key issues we wanted to highlight in terms of intersections. One is around issues of marriage, which has already been alluded to, and the other big area we want to talk about is issues tied to immigration, which has been a large theme here. And then the last formal question I'm going to ask is around the building of alliances really between what I'm calling allied groups, groups that are not focused exclusively or mostly on LGBT issues in terms of supporting the LGBT community. And so that's going to be the format of the panel. And if all goes according to plan, we will have some time at the end for questions from all of you. So I'd ask you to jot your questions down and ask them at the end. We'll save some time. So let's start with the hot button issue, which is marriage equality. Especially for those in California, actually, it's hard to go a couple weeks without seeing, actually a week probably even without seeing something in the headlines around marriage equality, or what some people call gay marriage. But we look at it as a civil rights organization, my organization, as one of the many equality issues that we work on together. I have an audience participation question, which is, who knows what state is voting on this issue next week? Besides Jenny Pizer, she's not allowed to answer. In the front. Maine. So Maine actually has a vote, and Washington State has something similar related to domestic partnerships. So it is actually one of the most high profile. In some cases, I actually think for most of us who are non-LGBT, many of us right now associate LGBT rights with the issue of marriage equality. LGBT issues, as you've heard already, are much deeper and broader, but it is, for better or worse, the biggest issue, the one that captures the most public attention currently. So the reason I'm bringing this up is that it's interesting, if you know anything about Asian American or ethnic studies history, there are actually some very striking parallels between communities of color and the LGBT community around the issue of marriage and marriage discrimination, specifically who's allowed to marry, who the government says can marry, and why. And so I'm going to turn to my panelists and ask a few of them if you can discuss this in a little more detail. Tell us, what is it that Asian Americans share with, or people of color in general, but Asian Americans in California in particular, what do we share with LGBTs around this issue? Who's first, Dorina?
I guess so. Can you guess who's going to be first? Yeah, I'd love to kind of share some information about the parallels between the anti-miscegenation and anti-immigration laws that were against family formation, that were targeted against Asians, and the current, the current discrimination that's targeting now LGBT families. I mean, you're all Asians here, so you know, many of you know our history as Asians. Ever since we came to this country, we stepped on this country, there's been restrictions about where we could live, what we could do, if we could vote, who we could marry. And so we were actually the first targets of the anti-miscegenation laws in California. I mean, we were the targets 100 years ago when there were interracial bans beginning in around 1901 that prohibited, whites from marrying Mongolians at that time. But of course, that wasn't enough to just limit Mongolians, because when they found out that, there's other Asian groups like Filipinos, right, that slipped through, they had to expand it. And so in 1933, then they included Malays, right? And they went through and tried to expand it to exclude all of us, right, as Asians. And so we know this history of bans against interracial marriages that were targeted against Asians. And now those same kinds of laws are targeting the LGBT community. But it wasn't only, those anti-miscegenation laws. And in fact, it wasn't until 1948 when the California was the first state actually to strike down the anti-miscegenation laws. And in fact, the California Supreme Court in the May 2008 case that struck down the marriage statute, they said that it discriminated against the LGBT community. They noted, of course, Perez v. Sharp, which is a 1948 case. They noted the parallels between the anti-miscegenation laws and the current ban on marriages for the LGBT community. But it wasn't until, of course, 1967 in Loving that actually, finally, the last of the anti-miscegenation laws were finally struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court in Loving v. Virginia. But it wasn't only the anti-miscegenation laws that prevented family formation that was targeted. It was also the anti-immigration laws that targeted the Asian community, so that it started with the Chinese Exclusion Act and the repeated passage and expansion of those exclusions to target other Asian groups. And in fact, even women white women who married Asians were stripped of their citizenship. So there was really a lot of restrictions on preventing Asians from forming families and integrating into the society, and the very same rationales that were used against forming, the family formation and in the Asian community are the very similar arguments that are being used now to prevent to allow same-sex couples from marrying. And I think probably some of the other panelists may talk more about, the arguments around, protection of children and that it's unnatural and ungodly and those kinds of arguments. And so, so this combination of anti-miscegenation laws and anti-immigrant laws targeting the Asian community, we have been able kind of to use those arguments to educate the API community and successfully to show that there are these parallels in our history that are being used to support the bans against same-sex couples.
And just one point of clarification on what Dorina said earlier. The term Mongolian was used back at the turn of the century to refer to basically what we now call East Asians, but Japanese, Chinese, Koreans, and then so Filipino was actually specifically exempted. So I know we don't use that term now. So it wasn't just people from Mongolia, but it was actually the large part of Asia that most people think of as Asian American. But it was, I think Dorina's point was that it was extremely explicit that Asians, then called Mongolians, were singled out in California statutory history. And the other point I would just want to make is that one of the results, which I think is interesting, of these laws, as you mentioned, around immigration and family, who can marry whom, is that Asians actually made up 10% of California's population in the early part of the 1900s. And admittedly, California had less people then, but we made up 10% of those who were here. After these laws were enacted and Asians couldn't marry legally, for the most part, that population dropped precipitously to under 2%, and really only hit the 10% mark again fairly recently because of expansions in immigration laws. And I think Hector has also done a lot of work on marriage, and so I'm going to ask him to talk. He has a national perspective on this.
Yeah, so I'm just going to pick up on some of Doreena's comments, and want to say that it's not quite forgotten, but it's really somewhat less visible nowadays that the very first nonprofit that came out in support of marriage equality, other than the ACLU, and I actually should specify the very first non-gay nonprofit, was the JACL, the Japanese American Citizens League, and it happened in 1994 in the context of a marriage case in Hawaii that Lambda Legal was involved in litigating, and we actually had our first taste of victory in the Hawaii Supreme Court that was ultimately snatched away, so our first sort of defeat as well through the ballot box. And that case did involve 3 interracial couples who were suing for marriage equality in Iowa. And I've been working actually in Iowa on marriage equality quite a bit, so I'm sorry if I get those mixed up. In Hawaii, and each of them involved an Asian partner with a Caucasian partner. And I think it's very fitting that the JACL was one of the first organizations, given the history that Dorina has talked about, and that was explained in a great brief that was signed by about, I think it's 63 Asian American organizations nationally and in California in the in remarriages cases, which is the case that won marriage equality here in California. And Karen was very, very involved in securing that work, in Dorina as well, and probably many others in the room. I also want to mention, as Dorina said, that in 1967, when the Supreme Court ultimately struck down anti-miscegenation laws for the entire country, that there were 16 states at the time that had anti-miscegenation laws. At their height, there were 39 states overall in the country that had anti-miscegenation laws, and about a dozen of them specifically mentioned, as Karen and Dorina said, Mongolians or the Mongolian race. And because I'm Filipino, I'm particularly interested in the 9 states that specifically prohibited interracial marriage between Malays and white folks. It's an interesting point of history for me as a Filipino person to know that we were also specifically targeted through the anti-miscegenation laws. And then I thought I'd just close in this part of it by talking about some of the justifications that have been used to support anti-miscegenation laws, which are many of the same or very similar justifications that are used today to oppose marriage equality. So as Dorina said, one of the sort of primary justifications is around religion. It's against God. God created Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. God didn't want the races to intermingle. These kinds of religious arguments are very parallel in terms of anti-miscegenation laws, in particular for all people of color and for same-sex couples who are seeking marriage equality. Another parallel argument is the supposed depravity or the disease-ridden nature of particular communities. So in the anti-miscegenation laws, particularly targeted Asian American, you see questions about, and again I'll talk about the Filipinos, like the dirty Filipinos who were blamed wrongly for starting a meningitis outbreak in 1929 in San Francisco. And people of color, Asian Americans, gay and lesbian people are often viewed as less than human. And one of the themes from Tom Perez's talk today was the more things change, the more they stay the same. In the mid-2000s, in a small town in Illinois, mayor's daughter, actually, a white woman, married a Filipino man. And this is in the mid-2000s, like around 2005. And the World Church of the Creator, which is a notorious racist and homophobic institution, actually had flyers distributed in that small Illinois town that had the title of Bestiality on top of them. And how could the mayor allow his daughter to marry this Filipino person? And then finally, I'll wrap up with this theme of it's bad for children. It's bad for same-sex kids to have, same-sex parents to have kids because of the social stigma and the problems that those kids supposedly will encounter. And then in the racial context, it's often been said that the offspring of those interracial connections would be inferior to other kids. And again, the more things change, the more they stay the same, because just 2 weeks ago, we heard in the case in Louisiana where a justice of the peace denied marriage license to an interracial couple because he was concerned for the children who might come of that marriage. And then there's a slight tweak, I think, with issues involving gay and lesbian marriage, or marriage equality for gay and lesbian couples. So it's not just bad for the children of those couples, it's now becoming bad for all kids that, oh my God, they might learn about there's applause in the background, they might learn about other families who, and might learn to respect other families who are different from theirs in the schools. Oh my God, that would be such a terrible thing for that to happen.
Well, interestingly, one of those so-called inferior offspring of an interracial marriage is now president of the United States, but the justice in Louisiana, I don't think, has been following current events. You know, and on the issue of judges, I wanted to make a comment about, I think, you know, one of the things about what people, you know, what Hector was talking about at the end, I saw this in some of the research we were doing for the amicus briefs that Hector mentioned, which is one of the many, many virtual documents that we have up online, is the California amicus brief signed by 63 Asian American organizations that actually chronicles that history of the parallels between Asian Americans around marriage equality, around marriage discrimination, and the parallels to the current struggle. But you know, I thought this was really striking that a judge back, I don't remember what the year was, but during the time of anti-miscegenation said, as a justification for not allowing people of different races to marry, that if God intended for people of different races to marry, they would not have been placed on different continents, and that was a judicial opinion. So it is striking that you can change the words a little bit, but it's really the same sentiments that keep coming back up, just in slightly different contexts, and that is really the theme of this workshop. And then one last thing on marriage before we move on to immigration is that one of the other things that we've loaded to the website is that Dorina alluded to this but didn't say it explicitly. So what I wanted to mention was that in California, groups like API Equality LA and our counterpart in Northern California, San Francisco, have been bringing home this message about the parallels in our two struggles, you know, the past struggle, the current struggle, and we've actually seen movement in the Asian American community on this issue. So there is a fact sheet that's on the website that actually looks at how Asian Americans voted in Southern California in 2000, which is the last time California voters voted on the issue of marriage equality, and again in 2008, last year, and there was significant movement. Asian Americans moved something like 3 or 4 times as fast in narrowing the gap on this issue as the rest of the population. So everybody moved in the right direction, meaning everyone's become more supportive, but Asian Americans have moved incredibly fast, and there's really no way to explain it except for, you know, the really hard work and organizing going on the ground to really change hearts and minds through arguments like what you just heard. Let's move to immigration-related issues. So one of the major themes of this conference, it's hard to escape from the plenaries and all the discussions, is immigration. It's a huge part of our community as Asian Americans and also Pacific Islanders, but it is something like 2/3 of our community is born abroad. And that is changing, of course, but it's still a large part of who Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are. For Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, one of the threads that connects many of us to the immigration struggle is the idea of keeping a family together, because many of us immigrate and then bring family members over, because for Asian cultures in particular, the togetherness of the family is extremely important. And this is also true for other communities like Latin American families that are, you know, the large extended family is extremely important. But there is one significant family relationship that doesn't often make the conversation in terms of when we talk about family. I think people understand, you know, family means mom and dad, it means like the kids and auntie and uncle and maybe grandma and grandpa. But there is one segment of the family relationships that often gets left out of this, even though we as Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders highly emphasize the family immigration as part of our immigration struggle. So I wanted to ask a couple of our panelists to address this. So, you know, what's being left out? Leading question. And can you talk a little bit about, you know, sort of what's being done to try and address that? Ben?
Thanks, Karen. I kind of wanted to start by putting some of this work in both a personal context as well as an organizational context for all of us here. So on one hand, you know, we're talking about intersectionality as the title, and thinking about how these different social justice movements intersect, and how for those of us who are at the intersections of these communities don't have the luxury of thinking about them separately in the ways that organizations do. So for me, for example, I don't have the luxury of ignoring the irony that the work that I did for Filipino World War II veterans was in a context in which I cannot serve in the military. And so I think that's something that I think we need to think about as we do this work, and as we think about the issue of allyship, which is the other thing I wanted to put on the table in terms of context for us to think about. Because we are always trying to think about inclusiveness and who is not at this table and how can we be allies to those folks. You know, we're gonna talk a lot about transgender folks in the context of this discussion, but there's, you know, but we don't have a lot of transgender folks at this conference. And so how do we as folks be supportive of that? You know, the transgender community has had a number of significant victories recently, along with the rest of us. as people who care about hate crimes recently. So I think there's a lot of resources regarding allyship, and I think we want to be able to talk about those so we can all learn together about how to be more supportive of the intersections of these social justice movements. But back to your question, I'm sorry. I wanted to start out by asking you all a question, and that is, how many of you are engaged in some shape or form with the comprehensive immigration reform debate that's happening right now? I saw some of you at the round table yesterday. So Karen noted one of the communities that is not being talked about, I think, enough in the context of this, and that is same-sex couples. And one of the pieces that's part of the comprehensive immigration reform debate, and we'll get into the debate and the heatedness of that debate, is the Uniting American Families Act, which is a piece of legislation that is intended to allow same-sex partners, binational couples, the ability to petition for each other in the same way that straight couples can petition to each other when they marry. So as a piece of legislation, this had really hobbled along for a number of years, for those of you who follow these sorts of things. And it really only got a lot of ground this year in this Congress. And I think it happened at the same time that an Asian couple, for better or worse, in sickness and in health, Shirley Tan and Jay Mercado emerged as an important case that outlined the real injustices behind this. How many of you are familiar with Shirley and Jay's case? Shirley and Jay are a Filipino lesbian couple just up north in Pacifica, here in California, and Shirley's petition for asylum was declined, and so ICE folks came to her house, knocked on her door, dragged her away, handcuffed her, and so they were only able to gain relief by a private bill that Senator Feinstein issued on their behalf. And really the only fix for them, for their situation, is the passage of the Uniting American Families Act. It is, for those of you who are doing the immigration reform debate, you know how controversial these issues already are, of undocumented folks, of family reunification, of enforcement. But here come the LGBT folks saying we need protections as well. And so, a debate that's already been controversial became even more so. And you saw that with the introduction this past summer of two companion bills in the House and Senate, the Reuniting Families Act, which I think we've talked about in other parts during this conference. Senator Menendez from New Jersey introduced the Senate version, which did not include the Uniting American Families Act. And the House version was introduced by Congressman Mike Honda, the chairman of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, did include it. And in no small part due to advocacy from many folks in this room and many folks in the state of California. So that piece is currently on the table. As you may have heard in other parts of the conference, Luis Gutierrez is going to introduce a comprehensive immigration reform bill shortly. I'm not sure, and maybe there's other wisdom in the room about the current status of whether we think this will be part of that bill or not. But a lot of folks in the room, and I hope all of you will also be interested in making sure that happens and that this piece is included in the debate. But I wanted to just close by saying two more things. One is, again, because of intersectionality, because of who we are as a complex set of identities, we as LGBT Asians and Pacific Islanders don't have the luxury of just entering this debate through the narrow construction of the Uniting American Families Act. I care about this because of the Filipino World War II provisions that are in that bill as well. I care about this because Filipinos, we keep talking about Filipinos, are have the longest backlogs. So I'll talk a little bit later in the context of this, and I wanted to actually ask Christina to pass it out. One of the things that we are doing in order to reaffirm our solidarity with the broader comprehensive immigration reform debate is we are doing some education in our own communities. We've issued our statement of principles that is trying to infuse an LGBT analysis to the comprehensive immigration reform debate and how we stand in solidarity with all of the other issues that are being talked about. In that informational sheet, some of them are translated in different languages. We have some South Asian languages too, so if that's what you're interested in, well, it's online as well, but I have some copies with it for me as well. And the other thing I just wanted to point to, and I'm hoping that you can help us out here, is there's a postcard as part of our postcard campaign inside that brochure. So if you could fill it out, put your name 4 times. I'm actually bringing these back to Washington next week, and we're going to be sharing them with Congressman Gutierrez in an effort to show him the solidarity of the broader API community. I have some more. I'll show them. So thank you.
Well, I think we've talked about Ben talked about the same-sex binational couples, and just, I think folks probably know, but just in case it's not clear, one of the reasons that for same-sex couples, the issue of immigration is particularly important is that because nationally or federally they cannot be married, it affects whether or not they can immigrate a partner, which is why there's this whole separate issue of how do you bring same-sex couples into the immigration debate, because they cannot do it the way straight couples could, which is you could bring your spouse over and you can bring a fiance over, because those marriages are legally recognized for people who are heterosexual. There are actually other immigration issues, and I'm just, actually, this is a little bit unscripted. I don't know if any of the other panels want to add. There are a ton of other immigration issues that deal with LGBT communities. Do any of you want to add anything on that? I mean, just a couple of comments, and just to throw out some of the other issues.
I mean, I guess I could talk about them I could talk about them very, very briefly. I mean, one other major issue, as I sort of mentioned earlier, is the issue of asylum and being able to petition for asylum based and withholding of removal based on sexual orientation or gender identity. Was it 1994 or 1993 when the first, when Janet Reno issued, 93 I think, when Janet Reno first issued a memo that sexual orientation was to be recognized as a particular social group, and so people could petition based on persecution based on their sexual orientation. So that was sort of a big step forward. Before that, it was somewhat unclear, and there were a lot of mixed, some cases had failed, in some cases had succeeded, and it was the first national acknowledgement that membership, that being gay or lesbian would constitute. So in case people don't know about asylum law, you have to fit into one of these categories: religion, political belief, race, something else, and membership in a particular social group. So sexual orientation's under that. And there are a lot of special challenges that LGBT people face that actually are faced by a lot of people in marginalized communities. One of the biggest ones is with the, I think it was passed in 96, IRIRA, the Immigrant Responsibility Something or Other Act, basically the Fucked Over Immigrants Act, pardon my language. But that's when they instituted this one-year bar, which is where a bunch of Congress people decided that it was totally reasonable to expect that immigrants who are fleeing persecution would be able to tell their story coherently to a US official within 1 year of entering the US, and if you didn't, you were not allowed to ask for asylum. And as you can imagine, people who are especially persecuted or especially marginalized in the communities that they find in the US or fail to find are very much unable to meet the 1 year bar, the 1 year filing deadline. And that's something that comes up in basically every case, almost every single case that we see. People have failed to meet the 1 year, and we have to try to get them in under one of the exceptions. And it's a huge problem, especially for transgender women who find it very difficult to get support even in the US, and find it difficult to tap into the networks that would enable them to learn about their ability to petition for asylum. So that's just to flag an issue that we would like to be part of comprehensive immigration reform. And I know it is already being talked about, getting rid of the 1 year bar, which has been pretty devastating. And then the other, actually a piece of good news, sorry, not to be all doom and gloom, is today we just found out, I just got a tweet during lunch actually, that they're definitely, HHS is definitely promulgating a new rule to end the HIV travel ban. right? Yeah. So, so the new rules are going to be promulgated on Monday, November 2nd, and then it'll take effect 60 days after that. So that's huge. I mean, that ban is also has been this like sword of Damocles hanging over the head of a lot of queer immigrants who would then have to basically previously, if you had HIV, the only way to try to stay in the country was through asylum or withholding. So, yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Ming. And those are important issues to raise because obviously immigration is partially related to the issue of the couples, but also there are these many other deeper issues, some of which have been addressed, like the HIV ban now, but many others which have not. Ming touched on some of the transgender issues, so let's move to the next question. I will say a couple years ago, I was listening to a presentation and was really struck by a comment from the person who was doing the presentation. It was talking about the rights of transgender individuals specifically, and the interesting overlap that actually came out of that talk I went to was that I have worked a lot on immigrant rights issues. My organization does a lot of immigration issues, and an issue that comes up repeatedly for immigrants, especially those who are undocumented, is issues around identification. So what is official identification? Do you have legal identification, which then affects all these other things, like can you get a driver's license? Can you enroll in certain programs? Can you, really it defines whether you are a real person in the eyes of the government or not. And the presentation I saw, which was very interesting, was around sort of the very similar struggles that people who are transgender face around identification. And if you just took out the words undocumented transgender, you could have been having the same conversation, which is what really struck me, because I'm not sure that these two parts of our larger community are actually working together, on issues around identification. So I know that I think both Ming and Hector's organizations deal with these issues, and I wanted to ask them if they could talk a little bit about this, this interesting parallel, because again, it's another opportunity for intersections and for working together.
Yeah, I'm actually, how many people here are sort of familiar with the transgender community, transgender people? Great, that's great to know. I want to start by going over some terminology, which is on this handout here. I just want to go over five terms that we're going to use that will be important, that we share an understanding about what it means in terms of transgender. So first of all, transgender is an umbrella term that's used to describe people whose gender identity, gender expression, their behavior is different from what would be expected of them based on the sex that they were assigned at birth. And gender identity itself is someone's sort of inherent sense of gender. And like sexual orientation, it is something that people consider innate and a core part of their presence, but it's very distinct from sexual orientation. Gender expression itself is how people manifest their gender and behavior and looks and dress and in different ways like that. And then two other terms that we want to just make sure that we're all on the same page about: passing, which relates to how people perceive, or that people perceive that a person is actually living in the gender identity that they feel for themselves. So how they present, and that people see that as their gender identity. And then transition is the process through which someone might change their gender. And that can be anything from, again, dress and behavior to medical means, hormones, and ultimately possibly sex reassignment surgery. And it's really just important for us to be familiar with those terms and be comfortable with them as we have this conversation, because there are important parallels between immigrant communities and transgender communities. And Ming is really going to take the lead sort of in talking about identification, and if there's some time at the end, I may add some stuff about other identification issues and detention issues in the immigration context. Yes,
Oh,
she
yeah.
is in the back.
Is it online too?
It is online.
So I guess I would like to start with a rhetorical question. Thank you, Hector, for actually going over those definitions. So Hector talked a little bit about gender identity and gender expression. And so my rhetorical question is, do people have an idea of what your legal gender might be? Does anybody hazard any guesses to what your own legal gender is, or how you figured that out? No, okay. Oh, that's great. Oh, yes, go ahead.
Well, I think I assume that, like, in the context where it used to be when you weren't talking about, like, gender queer, for example, or gender fluidity, it was kind of like a binary bipolar kind of system. It's like only male or female. And so a sex, supposedly sex assignment at birth, and the assumption is that that binary system is the only one that we embody, that as practice, I think that, for me personally, that I don't believe that.
Right.
But that's what I think the heterosexist paradigm would be.
Right. So yeah, thank you so much. So that covered a lot. So if you all couldn't hear, she had mentioned one important thing is that when you're born, the doctors take a look at you and decide that you fit into one of these two categories, and there are only two. And they decide then what gender to assign you at birth, and that goes on your birth certificate. But the truth is there really isn't such a thing as legal gender per se, and this is sort of, when I first thought about this, and when somebody said this to me, I was like, wow, this is totally blowing my mind. I mean, yes, I have a gender identity, but I don't really have a legal gender. What I have is a bunch of documents that list me as male. I'm just outing myself that I identify as male. And that I am identified as male legally on all of my documents, and all of my documents match, which is a great privilege, because I'm going to talk about now how it's actually really difficult for people who have transitioned or who are transitioning to get all of their documents to match up, and importantly, to get all of their documents to match their gender presentation and their gender identity. And this causes problems in pretty much the same situations that undocumented immigrants face problems because they don't have proper identification papers. And so both transgender people who find it difficult to get their gender marker changed and undocumented immigrants basically are very vulnerable to being challenged almost at any time they deal with an official. They're completely vulnerable to being challenged. For trans people, they're vulnerable to being outed in very similar situations. In the employment situation, when you get a no-match letter because you haven't been able to change your gender with Social Security, you can pretty much be outed then. Or, actually, I've heard this from Transgender Law Center, a lot of their clients of color, what they find is they get a no-match letter, and the employer assumes that they're undocumented because they're a person of color of a certain kind, Latino or Asian. So that's like a pretty direct intersection right there. So I don't know how much, Karen, you want me to go into the details of what the forms of identification and how to change them. I mean, we uploaded a document, ID Please, which is this great resource put together by the Transgender Law Center, and we uploaded it to the website. And I guess if you want to find out about the various forms of ID and how to change gender markers on them, if you have clients or community members who are having those difficulties, it's California specific, but it does have information about federal forms of ID as well. And you can always get in touch with TLC or with us or with Lambda if you do encounter clients or community members who would like to change their gender markers. So the various forms of ID are birth certificates, are a big one. Your driver's license or equivalent state ID, your passport, and your what your gender is listed as with Social Security. Because it's not actually, if you look at your Social Security card, if any of you still have them and haven't lost them like I have, there's not actually a gender marker on the card itself, but Social Security does have your gender in their database somewhere. I don't know where it is, but they do have it, and they will send no-match letters if your employer lists you as a gender that you identify or present as, but that Social Security does not believe that you are. So
I think what's an interesting commonality is essentially the point is that your true identity is not necessarily reconcilable with government-issued documents, right? But government-issued documents in this post-9/11 age in particular have become increasingly more and more important in terms of proving that you belong or that you have access to a number of rights. And so I do think of the many issues we talked about, I think there's a really particularly striking parallel here between immigrants, mostly undocumented, but also others in different categories, and the transgender community. And of course, some people are probably, unfortunately, both, right? I mean, it's probably the worst case scenario is to have, you know, both sets of those issues be in conflict. Maybe what we could do, because we want to make sure we have some time for questions, instead of going into more detail, I don't know, Hector, do you want to add a few things about what you had alluded to before we move to the last official question?
Sure. I just want to follow up on this identification question in terms of the Real ID Act, which, as we all know, has created lots of problems for immigrants and undocumented people. It's also created many problems for transgender people as well, in terms of the things that Ming has alluded to. You know, the real point of this is what Ming said as outing, you know, documents that may out somebody's history as having a different name or a different gender on a certificate. And really the point is self-control and self-identification for transgender people, for them to be able to, if they so choose or not choose, to out themselves and not have it done on documents. And you know, for the Real ID Act, the National Center for Transgender Equality and other advocacy groups were able to get some regulations issued that helped mitigate some of the concerns that they had around Real ID. So in terms of gender definition, that was left to the states. Like, we didn't want the Department of Homeland Security defining gender for people. And that, you know, states could keep information confidential in their databases about the documents that go into producing a Real ID, and that no record of names or gender markers would be on barcodes that are on the identification that are required under the Real ID Act. So, you know, if you've seen some ID, there's barcodes on them, and that information gets scanned, and there's information on there that talks about who you are. And so the fact that there is no past history of names or gender on them is important to the transgender community. And then in efforts to repeal or change Real ID, there are concerns moving forward. In a bill that was introduced in August, just this August, called the Pass ID Act, it actually would require states to store documents like birth certificates that could, again, out transgender people. They would require RFIC, radio frequency identification chips, in an ID card, again, and that's something that could be read from somebody that's far away. So a barcode, you gotta scan it under your ID under a machine, but with an RFIC, you could actually be from across the room, and if you had the right technology, you might be able to learn things about people from their ID. And so it's really about inadequate privacy protections in those ID contexts. And then I just really want to very quickly turn to the issue of transgender folks in immigration detention. And actually, these are issues that apply in all forms of detention related to transgender people, but there is definitely a misunderstanding and a lack of understanding of who transgender people are, and a certain inhumanity that's part of the immigration detention system that could make the issues that transgender people face even worse and scarier for them. Certainly there are issues of respect and safety. So if your gender identification is a certain gender, that you be treated in that gender, that you be called by certain pronouns, that you be called by your name that's consistent with your gender identity. And then the safety concerns related with being in sex-segregated detention facilities. And you know, what ends up happening a lot is that because prison officials and immigration officials don't know how to deal with transgender people, they decide to put them in administrative segregation or isolated confinement. Because they think that's for the person's safety, because they just don't have a way of dealing with transgender people. But then, you know, that further What's that word? Thank you. Then because often in those administrative segregation, you know, it's actually for punishment, right? So you don't get visitors. You don't get the exercise that you might in other detention facilities. You don't get the kinds of other quote-unquote benefits of being in the main part of a detention facility. And then finally, a big issue is continuing medical care, right? So for transgender people who are diagnosed and are on a treatment plan that includes hormones, those often get taken away in detention facilities. And actually Lambda Legal and others have cases where prisons, and actually in the state of Wisconsin, there's a law that was enacted that basically said that transgender people in prison couldn't receive hormone therapy or sex reassignment surgery. And this is medically necessary, prescribed by a doctor, in much the same way that any other medical condition would be prescribed and treated in a detention facility. By law in Wisconsin does not, and we're waiting a decision in that case.
Okay.
Can I just add one more quick thing?
Very quickly.
Sorry. Just sort of that there already are coalitions that have formed around this issue in sort of envisioning an alternative to the current way that identity documents are done. In two cities, New Haven and San Francisco, there are these municipal IDs that in order to get one, you do not need to show any proof of citizenship or legal presence, and the IDs also do not have a gender marker on them, which makes a lot of sense because for most of the services that you need to access, it's completely irrelevant what your gender is and whether or not you're a citizen. So for these cities to basically acknowledge that and issue municipal IDs, San Francisco started its ID this year in January, and New Haven had done it a year before, I think. And Oakland is now considering doing it. And groups of people of color organizations and queer organizations got together and formed coalitions to get these ID ordinances passed. So it's been pretty successful, and it's been yeah.
Thank you, Ming. We're going to shift slightly and try to, hopefully we'll still have time for some questions. So we've talked a lot about some issues where there are overlaps. What I wanted to move us towards now is to talk kind of more about what are groups doing to kind of bring together sort of the non-LGBT groups in particular to kind of engage and support issues affecting the larger the kind of this diverse LGBT community. And actually, I believe all of the panelists probably have something they can say here. I mean, they've all done this work in different ways in different places. And they come in very different shapes and forms, you know, everything from pushing back on anti-gay church sort of movements to, you know, bringing allies equally to the table on different issues. So Young Ho has been very quiet, and so I'm going to give him the opportunity to kick off this conversation. And he's our solo PowerPoint today. But I'm going to have him start by talking about the really very specific and also really wonderful but extremely challenging work in the Korean community that his organization has been doing, and then ask a couple of the other panelists to weigh in also on things that they've been doing. So Young Ho?
Okay, thanks. I would like to talk about the Korean Center's work engaging the Korean American voters on LGBTQ civil rights and Proposition 8 during November 2008. And as we learned from yesterday's presentation about, so will this work? Oh, it works. Okay. So as we learned from yesterday's Asian American survey about their attitudes in politics, Korean Americans were among the top resisting to accept LGBT community members because they're so highly religious and so forth. So we have done, it's mostly educating on LGBT rights in general, not necessarily marriage equality in our case, because I think in the Korean American community, we are not at that level of, we accepted LGBT members, and then we're gonna accept the marriage or not, but it's more, should LGBTQ members be accepted or exist or something like that. It was at that level of discussion that the Prop 8 this debate ensued during November 2008. So we have done some work in the past And we have signed on letters, and we have sometimes put ads and worked with organizations. But in 2008, this was our first time engaging voters in a general campaign effort. So our voters outreach was through mailers. So we mailed voter guides to about 30,000 voters. This is the voter guide. And we decided that we focus on certain propositions, 4, 6, and 9, and some other propositions that are still important, but were not as, we didn't feel we couldn't prioritize them, but we felt they're still important. We would have recommendations, and a very small description. For Prop 8, we said, let's protect the rights of minorities. Please vote no on Prop 8. And in the community, there's a very, very strong reaction against it. A lot of it fueled by churches, a lot of community members. Some of the reactions besides this that I forgot to put is, I thought you were working, Korean Research Center was working for the American community, and now you're betraying us, and things like that. So, and this made us realize that although we had worked on a lot of issues, immigrant rights, civil rights, health reform, we had this blind spot where we were not having the civil rights focus, the proper civil rights focus. So how could we bring this back? That was our main challenge. And we are a little bit late in the game. This was already mid-October when we started getting the negative feedback, but we tried to do what we could. And we decided phone banking, which we were already conducting, was not the proper channel because we would not have face-to-face experience with the voters. So instead, we produced some materials on educating people about LGBT rights. We tried to put some more faces there. We also improvement over our Prop 22 ad, which only said protect the rights of minorities, but now it said, look at these community members who are Korean Americans, they're LGBTQ, and they contribute to society. So we need to accept them into our communities. And we passed them out through our precinct walking when we visited voters in Koreatown and in Orange County, and through our office. People came to our office. It was a very small effort, very small outreach. And then we also engaged, there was a heavy media outreach going on for Prop 8. So there are a lot of organizations putting ads for Prop 8. And there's a funny thing, and in the beginning, I think a major church pastor made a mistake, and he was saying, we need to be against gay people, please vote no on Prop 8. And a lot of people, so a lot of the media scrambled and tried to remedy it like that. So every time they mention Prop 8 in the media, they would say, and by the way, if you're against gay people, you need to vote yes on Prop 8, and trying to do that. So we didn't have a very friendly media. So we tried to get pastors for LGBTQ rights to go on radio talk shows and to publish columns. And that was I think, hopefully that had the biggest impact. The elections didn't go as well as we thought we could. But after that, we realized we need to educate the community in the long term and have people more sensitivity about the issue. So we have been working with a group of Korean allies, Korean Americans, called Korean Americans United for Equality. And we have little flyers here. And we have a website. We have started working this year, and we are welcoming new members. So if you're interested, check out our website. Thanks.
Thank you, Young-ho. And I've worked with Young-ho and his organization a long time, and they really do have an uphill battle. It's a very tough community to move in, but they have done tremendous work. And I will say one thing that I just want to, he didn't say this, but the organization, because of its positions, was actually singled out by churches who used to support them, for example, who stopped giving money, stopped coming to their fundraising dinners. They got hate calls. I think all the staff individually, people found them, left them messages in Korean, I think, right? Basically cursing out the staff, and they actually, they were actually, I think, more invigorated after that to continue. But I do think that shows extreme perseverance. I think Tom's number 7 point, Tom Perez's point, was around perseverance, and I think there's a lot more perseverance that's needed. But I just want to express my extreme admiration for the Korean American activists in LA who really are facing one of the greatest challenges. There are a couple other folks I know who wanted to say some things around the work with allied organizations, and I think Dorina probably wants to talk a little bit about the work that API Poly LA is doing.
Right, and then we have our pamphlets back there that I want everybody to pick up and to look at. We also have a lot of information on our website. It's on our pamphlet, but it's www.apiequalityla.org. So that's fairly easy, hopefully, for you to remember. But yeah, we are really fortunate that we were one of our primary goals has always been that we wanted to build a coalition, not just, to get the API LGBT community on board, of course, but also to outreach to the API civil rights communities. And so a lot of our supporters are actually it's a broad range of social service agencies and advocacy groups, community-based agencies, legal groups, like KRC, Asian Pacific American Legal Center. They kind of form the core of, I think, API Equality LA and give us the credibility in the community to do the outreach that we do all the time. So what we do is we have lots of different strategies about how to educate the community around marriage equality. We do one-on-ones. We go out to the community. We go out to community fairs and to talk and to share our stories, because we think that for the API community sometimes doesn't see the parallels, so we try to point that out. They also don't maybe realize that there's a lot of us that are part of the API community. I mean, there was a Williams Institute study that showed that there's at least 38,000 same-sex couples across the country, and California actually has the largest number, over 13,000. And so we feel like for some of us who are LGBT, we are good messengers, but also I think we need our allies to go out and talk to other straight community to show why they think marriage equality is important, not as an LGBT person, but as a person that believes in civil rights and believes that discrimination is bad, and why they are involved and support our organization. And so by having these one-on-one conversations, and also going out to API groups to do kind of speaking engagements, and we do community education and town halls and speakers bureaus, and also we have done a lot of work around with the media. And actually, Karen is actually our co-chair of our media committee. But we've been very conscious of trying to develop relationships with the media, because what we discovered was before API Equality LA was around, a lot of the media articles were very negative when they talked about anything that had to do with the LGBT community. There was use of derogatory terms, and it was very unbalanced. And what we've seen, the change over the last few years, is that we've gotten them to include our stories about our relationships and our families. And so at least now it's balanced. At least if they do have something, that is as like supportive of Prop 8 or anti-LGBT, they do have balanced stories on the other side. So we've seen a change in that regard. So basically, what we've tried to do is try to draw those parallels for racial justice and LGBT rights. And just one quick example of how we've done that, Hector mentioned our work around getting support for the amicus brief, the friend of the court brief in the in-ray marriage cases. But I think we actually use that as a strategy to do some community organizing work. And actually, in the materials, you will see. I think you included your article, right, Karen, in the materials?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
If not, it will be up there shortly.
Oh, okay. but because Karen did an article of explaining this, but we used that amicus brief strategy that resulted in 63 groups that that was based on our common history and the common struggles and the parallel discriminatory efforts that are targeted both the API and the LGBT community. But we did that because we knew that would initiate conversations, around LGBT issues and the marriage equality issue. And so we were able to use that to go to different community groups, especially legal groups, that may not have been open to trying to take a position on a political issue, but in a legal issue they may have. And so we were able to talk to a lot of groups, and also some groups that maybe weren't able to take a position at the time, but over over time, by talking about it and educating that group, they were able to support it. So an organization like the Organization of Chinese Americans, who didn't sign on to the brief per se, but actually a few months later, they actually came out with a resolution in support of marriage equality, and that helped for the election in 2008. So those kinds of efforts, these ongoing efforts in working in coalition with the groups, not only in the API community, but also in other communities of color. We've reached out to working in African American communities with other, not only in the LGBT community, but also African American and Latino civil rights organizations. And they actually have, because of the parallels in the Prop 8 struggle, when we were trying to strike that down as a violation of equal protection, because you take if the rights of one minority can be taken away, any minority becomes vulnerable. That kind of common argument, I think, was heard by a lot of communities of color, and so that's another way that we were able to kind of educate and work across communities to maybe help them understand why they should be supportive of the LGBT community.
Did anyone else want to add anything before we open it up for audience questions?
I actually would like, because one part of it is LGBT people reaching out to the API community. The other part is APIs and other people of color reaching out to the broader LGBT movement, which, you know, from my perspective as a gay man of color in this movement, has not been the best at addressing issues of people of color and other social justice issues that aren't part of the LGBT experience. And I think that the organization that Ben was talking about in Capia is really an important voice to help bring some of that to the broader LGBT movement. And I don't know if you want to say anything more about that, not to put you on the spot, but I think it's important to note that it's not just LGBT people talking to the API community.
Right, yeah, I mean, I think in essence, we view our work out in two frames. One is working with our API brothers and sisters to make sure that they are aware of these issues regarding those of us in our communities who are LGBT, but it's also calling out our brothers and sisters in the LGBT community about the lack of analysis of race and ethnicity in the social justice movements regarding sexuality and gender expression and all of these things. So, again, at the intersections of these communities, those are sort of the two battles that we fight, or the two partnerships that we're able to make, depending on the time of day.
So actually, I did just want to just mention that, one of the, I think, effective ways that we've been able to work and develop relationships with other groups is to work on cross issues, so that we, as API Equality LA, have actually organized contingents in marches on immigration rights and taken positions on comprehensive immigration reform. So we have to build those kinds of relationships and work on those issues that actually affect all of us, right?
And just to piggyback on what Dorina said, one thing I think has been very deliberate about what API Equality LA has done was actually to walk in immigrant rights marches very clearly as a queer LGBT contingent. So not just another set of API faces, but it was very important, I think, to have a presence. And so I do think there is a larger struggle. Of course, we're focused on what APIs can do because this is the API, Asian American Pacific Islander Advancing Justice Conference. So we're happy to take this roadshow on the road to any sort of national LGBT conferences as well, because I agree that it needs to go both ways. We wanted to make sure there was a little bit of time for audience participation, so I want to thank my panelists actually for being so conscious of the time. I'm not sure I've ever facilitated this many lawyers on time before, so not everyone's a lawyer, but there's a lot of lawyers up there. Let's take some questions from the audience, and I'm going to give you a mic so that you can speak to everyone in the room. So, questions?
Go back to the issue of comprehensive immigration reform. Ben mentioned the Gutierrez bill earlier, and I wanted to go back to a discussion about that. I work for an immigrant rights coalition in Illinois, and of course we're all very excited about this progressive bill that's being crafted as we speak, and I think the timeline for its introduction is probably early December, right? But at the same time, we're hearing rumblings that Catholics and evangelicals are threatening to pull their support of this bill because of the UFO language. And so my question is, knowing that might happen, what's our strongest argument? What can we do at this point? How can we combat that?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of the things that we've been saying are the arguments, right? I mean, we're part of the community. We are immigrants. Actually, I think one of the things, we were part of a contingent of national LGBT groups, the only one that was particularly focused on people of color, that met with USCIS to talk to them about some of these issues regarding immigration. There's this immigration LGBT working group that they're developing now. And I think one of the things that is most interesting to me is that a lot of these issues regarding transgender stuff, a lot of these kinds of, you just have to fix the system, and that's like the best, perhaps that's the most convincing argument, maybe just to a bureaucrat, but to fix the immigration system in a very comprehensive way has to include all of us. Otherwise, it's just going to continue to be broken. These people are going to fall through more cracks, if LGBT folks are left out of it. I mean, I think, and this is where allyship really matters. I've seen this, you've seen this in a lot of the coalitions, hopefully that all of you are on. Person for person, progressive folks support these kinds of issues, I hope. But it matters where we come down as organizations. And so whether or not we are able to stand up as OCA or to stand up as Lambda Legal and support LGBT rights and immigration is important. And so, it boils down to a question of fairness, but you're right, it's hard. And we've seen how the Catholics and the Catholics are actually the only faith-based group that has raised this particular issue to that extent in terms of their reservations about the Uniting American Families Act. The other faith-based groups are actually either in support or laying low.
Other questions and comments?
Hi, I have a question that I've been personally grappling with for a while. I'm a Vietnamese American lesbian woman, and I came out to my parents a couple years ago, and it was rough, but they're cool. Privately, they're cool with it now. But the issue really is that sort of socially or publicly, they don't really know how to support it or even how to communicate to the peers about the issue. And for a community that gets most of its sort of political beliefs through social networks and sort of ethnic media, it's certainly not something that's very talked about. And I think my parents just don't really have the tools or the sort of mechanisms to cope with the issues and to talk about it publicly. And I think if we need to sort of build a public movement to support these things, that's what it's going to take. So the question is, what resources are there for people like my parents, to be able to do something about this and to really be part of the movement?
I think we do have a lot of work to be able to I don't know if your parents are limited English speaking or, right. We need to do a lot more work trying to not only develop materials, but, be able to talk about this issue comfortably to limited English speaking populations, because we know that they actually are not as supportive, but part of it is they don't have that information, right? And so, we are trying to, expand our coalition to include, communities, Southeast Asian communities, and to develop materials and work with, there's, APIP flag and those groups where hopefully, peers could talk to each other. But, so we just have to develop all of those resources, and it is a challenge. And so I would invite you, to join API Equality, a group like API Equality LA, so that we can actually think about how we can do that. Because there are resources out there. And so what does it mean? How could we, to figure out how can we best reach those communities, right? Because, and I know there's a willingness to do that. It's just that we just have to kind of, make it a priority, and so.
And actually, I just want to add on to what Dorina said, because part of your question dealt with media and essentially who are spokespeople who kind of raise the message to a higher level. And one of the challenges that we have is, really a lot of the people who are either out or allies are second generation or third generation who don't speak any of the Asian languages fluently enough. And I'm somebody who speaks only English, and my second language, if it's anything, is French, which is, of course, also not helpful in this context. But one of the challenges is really getting people in our community to either, those who have language skills to really get comfortable playing this role. And when we, during the Prop 8 campaign, had a very interesting just sort of anecdote where a lawyer in our office, fluent in Mandarin Chinese, went on Chinese news to actually defend the no on Prop 8 side up against a yes on Prop 8 side, because the Chinese news only wanted to cover 2 issues that night during elections. They wanted to cover Obama versus McCain. They wanted to cover yes and no on Prop 8. And we were told later that for some people who were Chinese speaking, to actually hear someone who wasn't gay but was a lawyer talking about gay rights as a civil rights issue in fluent Mandarin actually had a huge impact, because it was different. It was almost like their kid had been telling them for years in broken Chinese that this is a civil rights issue, and it didn't make that much difference. And all of a sudden there was this lawyer saying that, and it made a huge difference. And that was sort of striking to me. I mean, we've talked about this in my office, like, if we do anything, we need to actually send all of our lawyers to intensive Chinese and Korean and Tagalog and Vietnamese, and then put them out there to talk not just on this issue, but issues around undocumented and all the hard issues in our community, because the only messages the first generation is getting is unfortunately from other first generations. So this is a very long struggle that's going to take years, but I think it's a very good question, and this is one of the reasons we put this workshop in this conference, was to encourage all of our groups who don't do LGBT issues specifically to really help raise this profile.
There are 2 other resources I'd point you to. One is API Family Pride. They're a group in San Francisco. They've kind of been working with API PFLAG down here. APIFamilyPride.org. One of their really kind of moving things is they do this wall of honor, where families honor their LGBT sons and daughters and family members. So that's one thing. And I believe there's some Vietnamese folks that are part of that. The other thing I would point you to is the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, glad.org. They have a media toolkit for Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. And so that has a lot of sort of, and there's films and other kinds of resources. I mean, I think some of the other groups have some resources as well, but those are the 2 that I think are most. And NCAPI is trying to document all of these different things, because there's so much really interesting work going on the ground in terms of visibility, in terms of doing these kinds of things, and we want to be able to try to help coordinate all of that and put it into one place for folks.
Two quick questions. One, I was wondering if you would be able to share your thoughts on the New Jersey experience. As many of you probably know, when the New Jersey Supreme Court came down on the marriage issue, it held on the equal protection component, but as to what to call it, left it up to the legislature, and the legislature decided to call it civil unions. I was wondering if any of you had any thoughts about whether there should be a movement within, or there should actually be called marriage. And then secondly, I was wondering, just for my own curiosity, can you give me an update as to any current litigation that's revolving around the Prop 8 issue right now?
Well, I'll sort of take the New Jersey question, because actually that's a case that Lambda Legal litigated, and I had some work was involved in terms of the media strategy. So yes, we had a constitutional victory, but without the name in New Jersey, which was, I believe, in 2007. I may be wrong about the date. And since then, and the legislature was forced to create a system that created a sense of equality with all the rights and benefits for gay and lesbian couples, but they named it civil unions and not marriage. And ever since that time, a group called Garden State Equality has been working to push the legislature to adopt marriage equality. And by all accounts, similar to what's been happening in New York, in terms of trying to get the legislature to adopt marriage equality there, it's all very close. I would expect possibly something happening before the end of the year. And hopefully it will be a successful marriage equality bill through the New Jersey legislature. But that group has been working for the last few years to build up those numbers in the legislature to make sure that we have the votes to get that enacted. So Somebody want to tackle where?
Jenny
Yeah, actually. That's
We'll ask the National Marriage Director for Lambda Legal to answer that question.
I think so the question was ongoing litigation challenging Prop 8. And the main litigation that's going on now is a federal challenge to Prop 8, which is being litigated in Northern California by one of the most famous same-sex couples in the country, Ted Olson and David Boies, who are the two lawyers who are representing the plaintiffs. And that's the proponents of Prop 8 are participating in that case, and they sought to have the case thrown out, relying on a very old case. And Judge Walker said, no, I want to hear this case. I disagree with your arguments. We will have a trial, and the trial is set to start in January. And it promises to be very exciting, lots of interesting legal questions in it, promises to have some experts and evidence, and we will see what happens. Whatever happens, I think we're all expecting that it would probably go from that court to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeal, and perhaps beyond that, it's way too early to tell. But it is exciting litigation, high stakes, in good hands, and we will all be staying tuned.
I just wanted to, I don't know if this was your question, but I just wanted to just respond that, why it should be marriage equality, why it should be marriage and not civil unions. I mean, just from a personal perspective, and why it really does make, why names matter, and that separate is never equal, right? And so, and I would never really have really guessed that the term marriage would mean so much if I hadn't gotten married myself recently, last year. And then I realized, oh, okay, well, so this is what they mean when we are married. I mean, the automatic kind of respect for the relationship that you get, the way that people understand what that means, and the acceptance, and it just I guess in a personal way, I think when somebody gets married, people understand that, but when somebody says, oh, I had a civil union, they go, oh, what's that? That's interesting, right? And so I think that we do need to push for marriage and not settle for civil union.
So I know there were a few other hands. I'm going to ask the speakers to take questions, stay after to take questions, but I did want to let a friend from the Williams Institute, which was referenced earlier, just make a few comments about Williams Institute, which has done wonderful data, which I think would actually be helpful for folks who want to do advocacy. So, Christopher.
Yeah, so my name is Christopher Ramos. I'm a research associate at the Williams Institute, which is a sexual orientation law policy think tank at the UCLA School of Law. And I just wanted to highlight a report that Serena alluded to and that I co-authored with Gary Gates. And it's on the API community. The large focus on California, both those and same-sex couples, sorry, it's useful, using the census data and also using the California Health Interview Survey, the larger LGBT API community of the state. And there you could have the tools, the actual data, the empirical proof to back up some of the statements we talked about. You could look at the fact that 25% of the API LGBT community is a foreign citizen, to talk about the immigration issue and the importance of binational, the United American Families Act and that binational legislation. And also alluding to the PowerPoint, the fact that being gay is un-Korean or not Korean, the simple proof that we have this report, and highlighting the socioeconomic and demographic profile of API LGBT people is useful in and of itself. So that's a resource. If you just Google Williams Institute, I'm sure you could find it.
We'll also post the link to the reports on the conference website.